Startups are like really, really hard, and you're going to want to quit. And if you kind of think you're kind of the if you think you're kind of the exception who's like never going to want to quit, I've literally never met a founder who like at some point, if they were being honest, like didn't want to quit. They've all thought about quitting, including me.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Today's event is on 5 things you should know before starting startup.
For everybody that's kind of like here, I'm assuming kind of people are kind of like, if you're joining this, you're kind of like probably thinking about starting a startup. And so maybe startups are kind of relatively new to you, but it's unlikely you're somebody who has kind of like started a startup and you're like 5 years in or something like that. The definition of kind of like starting a startup, as Pranav said, is like quitting your job. Now, obviously, that's just my definition, but I think it's a useful kind of framing for this because I think sometimes people think about starting a startup as like, working on a project on weekends, or sometimes people think about it as finding co-founders. And there's lots of kind of different things that people kind of like think of as starting a startup. Like sometimes they think about like, oh, I go to like AWS events and like that's starting a startup, right? And so it's kind of all these different pieces, and it's hard to have like a productive conversation around it unless we can kind of draw the line so people can kind of understand kind of like where they're going from. The reason why I draw the line around quitting your job is because that is kind of the leap of faith. Until you quit your job, you can always kind of just like go back, right? You don't quit your job, you work on something for a couple weekends, it doesn't work, it's no problem, right? You go to AWS events, you eat their free food, don't end up kind of starting a startup, also okay, right? And so quitting a job is kind of like, to me, like you are officially a founder when you quit your job, as far as like, and again, this is just my definitions. I'm not trying to gatekeep these like rules or whatever, but that's how I think about it. It doesn't matter how well your startup does. If you quit your job and you took the leap of faith, you're in the club, is kind of like how I think about it. And so I think that also ends up being kind of the tipping point that is like the difference between kind of like all the people who are interested in startups and then all of the actual kind of like founders. And so I think it's a good kind of like tipping point to kind of like talk about, and what people should know before they kind of make that kind of like decision. So just framing of kind of like why we pick this as kind of the like delineation, is kind of like for those reasons. I think it ends up being into these two buckets, which is the practical bucket and then the kind of personal bucket. And the practical bucket, like that one is, here's what practically you should know before you start a startup. And to me, that's all like, okay, you should know all these things, which will hopefully decrease your chances of like dying and your startup dying. And then the personal bucket is like, okay, please prepare yourself for all of these things, and hopefully that will decrease your chances of quitting. And so I think, startups end up not working either because they die, or because the founder kind of like quits. And so,
So I'm going to start off with the more practical stuff. Yeah.
mm,
And these are things that I had questions before I started up as well. So I'm going to go directly to the meat of it. Finances. It's what everyone's like, because there's obviously opportunity cost before you start a startup. Um, how should people think about financial runway before they decide to start?
yeah, this one is, I mean, way to start with like the most practical kind of like piece of this, right? So you want to know how long you can go without making any money, because you're not going to make any money. In fact, you probably are going to lose money, and you're probably going to be spending money on your startup, right? So at a minimum, how long can you go without kind of like making any money? And you want to basically calculate your own kind of personal runway here. And to me, this is different for everybody, right? And you can have the conversation of kind of like, okay, how long can I sustain my current lifestyle? I don't cut back on anything, I don't do anything. How long is that going to be? You can also play the game of like, okay, if I cut back on some percentage of kind of the expenses, how long does that go? And typically the way that, at least I've talked to kind of friends about doing it, is you want to kind of have both of those. So, okay, I live my current lifestyle, I eat out this many times. Okay, this is the runway. And then kind of the one that is like, okay, if I cut back, this is the time. Um, if your runway ends up being, I kind of just pulled this out of nowhere, but if your runway is less than 3 months, I don't think that's enough time just to kind of like share with people. Like, you're not going to get that far in kind of like 3 months. And if that's all the time you kind of have, that last month you're basically going to just be like really stressed out. And so you're not going to get much done there. So you really only have kind of like 2 months, and you're just not going to get enough done. So again, I think this is highly personal, but I think if it's less than 3 months, I'd be very worried. So like Pranav, if well, if you were a friend of mine, you were coming to me and you're like, hey, I'm thinking about starting a startup, and I was like, hey, how much personal runway? You're like 3 months. I'd probably talk you out of it.
Yeah.
If you have less, 6 months is probably the minimum, and even then, I'd probably be like kind of nervous, right? 12 months, I think you're in like pretty good shape, where you're like, okay, I can kind of like figure some stuff out and not kind of like too pressured and that kind of stuff. And so kind of like rough guides for people. But you want to be able to kind of do this. Side benefit of calculating kind of the runway here is you get some structure into kind of like what you're doing. So, you know, you want to work backwards. So if you're like, okay, I'm going to do this startup, I've got 6 months. Okay, how am I going to spend my 6 months so that I can kind of get where I need to go, right? And if you're really going to run out of money after 6 months, you basically need to figure out how to fundraise within those 6 months. Otherwise, your startup is going to die, right? So you can kind of work back from that, and it gives a kind of like endpoint. So that ends up actually kind of practically being useful, but you kind of want to have an understanding of kind of like what your runway is as like a first part. Did you do this, Pranav? I didn't do this when I first started, and I probably should have, but like I didn't. Okay, you didn't do it either. Okay, cool.
I think 6 months of sustained lifestyle. Yes, not 6 months of like scrapping. 6 months of sustained lifestyle, I think, is a good number where you can kind of extend to 12 and lifestyle down. But I didn't
Yeah,
do it at all.
and that's kind of a good point, right? Where you know, if you're like, if in order to get to 6 months, if you're like, I have to eat like rice and beans every day, and like I can't do anything else, okay, you're probably too tight. But you know,
Yeah.
something kind of in there.
So the second thing I want to ask is, and this is something I also sort
Yeah.
of experienced, is what, because we delineated when you start a startup with when
Yep.
you quit your job, right?
Yep.
So one of finances, and the second thing is, how do I know if it's the right time with my idea? So how do I
Oh,
know if my idea is at the right stage or if it's validated? What's the timeline to make that decision?
yeah. Maybe I'll kind of break this out kind of like a little bit more. So, um, you need you need to figure out kind of the runway, but kind of the bigger things you need to kind of like figure out before you actually quit your job is you need to have a problem you want to solve. Now, this sounds like duh, but you'd be surprised how many startups have a product they want to build, but not a problem that they want to solve. And they're very, very different things. Um, and it's funny sometimes, like when people say they have a product, when people like have a product they want to build, actually it's just a laundry list of features. So it's not even really a product. It's like they want to build this like feature. And those are very different things. Okay, why are they such different things? If you have a product you want to build and you quit your job, you will then go build that product and you will probably be wrong. Like nobody's going to want that product. I have never built a product right off the bat and it was like something people wanted. It's never happened, right? And what the product ended up being was quite different from kind of what I originally kind of expected. And so, if you just come in with a product and you find out that's not a product people want, then you're going to be like, well, shit, what do I do now? And that's very different from having a problem you want to solve. So if you have a problem you want to solve, then look, you're just going to go figure out, okay, I have a problem I want to solve. What is a way to solve this problem? And that can be a product. And you can go figure out, be like, okay, well, if is that something that kind of people want? And if it's not something people want, you're like, okay, cool. What is another way that I can kind of solve this problem for people? Right. Um, and so again, I think it sounds kind of silly, but like to everybody who's kind of like started a startup before, there's like a really kind of big like difference here. Pranav, is this something you can resonate to? I feel like as soon as I said it, you're like, yep, this is like a
I
thing.
built so many products that don't solve anything. It's so many times, spent so much time just
By the way,
solving a
that's the
problem that doesn't
realest
exist,
thing
right?
I feel like founders can like say is just like, and by the way, Pranav's not new. I have built so many products that like don't solve anything and that like nobody wants. I think number one, like I mean, I guess financial runway, you want to calculate that. Two, you want to have a problem that you want to solve and you want to have a good articulation of it. It can't just be like, I want to help small businesses. That's not actually a problem. That's like just a thing you want. Right. And so what is the problem you're kind of like wanting to solve? So that's the second piece. The third piece I would kind of talk about here is you want to validate the problem and kind of the solution. So I think that's the third piece here. So even if you have a problem that you want to solve, you can actually do a lot of validation before you ever quit your job. And I think that's like super, super important. Um, what you don't want to end up doing is you don't want to quit your job and then 2 months in find out basically that nobody wants the product that you were going to build and nobody cares about the problem that you're trying to solve. And then you're kind of like, well, shit, do I just go get a job now? And it turns out you can actually validate quite a lot before you end up quitting your job. And so again, you just want to de-risk as much as possible before you actually end up quitting your job. And I think validating is like a really important piece of this. Um, Validation is like an entire branch of kind of thing to like learn about. And we don't have the time to kind of go super deep into it. I think as part of Startup Academy, we have a lot of kind of courses and kind of like content on kind of validation because we talk about it quite a lot. But the basic idea is that you want to get a reasonable you want to gather evidence that the problem you're working on is a problem that people really care about and that your solution actually solves that problem, and so you want to gain as much evidence as you can for that. You're never going to know for sure whether your idea works and is something people want or that the product is something that people want, but you want to gather as much evidence as you like possibly can. um Maybe I'll kind of pause there on the validation
Yeah.
part. Did
Yeah.
you validate?
No.
Okay.
I think one of the differences is also idea versus problem. And we talk so much about the idea, and
Yeah.
idea is almost always the solution.
Yep.
Whereas I think validation focuses so much more on the problem, and whether it exists or not. But I did not. I had
Yeah.
the idea and then I built product.
Actually, maybe what's kind of useful for people is no, maybe talk a little bit about kind of like what was the startup that you worked on, and then we can talk a little
Yeah.
bit about kind of like what would it have meant to kind of validate that, just to give people kind of like a flavor.
The last startup I worked on was a co-working marketplace. So people who want to access a co-working space just for the day can access that instead of getting a full monthly membership, and they can access like 60 different co-working spaces uh, with just one app and pay per usage. I built a lot of product before I started validating that. And I'm actually kind of curious. I don't think we've ever spoken about this. I'm curious to know how you would validate that without building things.
Oh, I mean, that's relatively kind of like actually straightforward. So, okay, slide aside and we can kind of get back to other stuff.
Yeah.
But here's how I would have validated that. And this will give people kind of an idea of kind of like what this is. And I will frame it in a way such that you can do all these things before without ever quitting your job. So, for Pranav's idea, you need two groups of people. You need co-working spaces and you need people who want to work at co-working spaces. So those are the two groups of people that you kind of want to know. Um, and you need both of them to want your product, and you need it in order for this to work, right? So I don't know if a lot of people want kind of like day passes at co-working spaces and a lot of different ones or whatever, but the co-working spaces don't want to do this, then you're screwed. If the co-working spaces really want to do this but nobody actually kind of wants it, you're also screwed. And so the thing you need to kind of figure out is like, do both sides kind of reasonably kind of want this thing? So, I mean, the consumer side is relatively straightforward. I mean, you just do the whole landing page, you make a landing page, you talk about kind of what it is, you get people to sign up. That's all pretty straightforward. Like, um, if it is something that people really want and you're kind of like solving a problem, you can probably get kind of like 200, 300 people to kind of like sign up for that landing page is my kind of like take. You could do some paid ads. You can kind of do a bunch of kind of like growth stuff to kind of like figure it out, but you could probably do that. I would then take that list and go to kind of co-working space and being like, hey, I have 300 people who are interested in kind of doing this thing. I want to add you as part of this kind of network that I'm building. And then, here's how it'll work and that kind of stuff. And then you get them on board. Um, you can do all of that before you quit your job, right? You can make that landing page over a weekend. You can start working on it kind of like Sundays and that kind of stuff. And then you can just go to co-working spaces with your list, right?
Why do you want to start up?
Oh,
And I think this gets tested through the journey. But how can people tell
yeah. Okay.
if they should start something?
Yeah. So, okay, so we talked about kind of like three things for the practical side, right? So you want to calculate your runway, you want to have you want to have an actual problem that you're trying to solve, and then you want to be able to kind of validate that kind of like before you actually start. So those are the three kind of practical stuff. So let's talk about kind of like personally what you kind of need to know, to kind of like steel yourself for the experience. Why this ends up being really important is, everybody kind of knows this, but I feel like they don't know what the experience actually is like. Startups are like really, really hard. And you're going to want to quit. And if you kind of think you're kind of the if you think you're kind of the exception who's like never going to want to quit, I've literally never met a founder who like at some point, if they were being honest, like didn't want to quit. They've all thought about quitting, including me, right? And so I think there's a lot of this too, where I think one of the things you need to know is what like there's an entire family of things you need to know, which is around kind of just like what is this experience going to kind of like be like, and how do you prepare yourself for that? And you definitely kind of need to know about this before you start a startup. The thing that Pranav is kind of alluding to here is I remember kind of specific points through kind of the startups that I started where I absolutely kind of like wanted to quit. And I remember a few points where I actually went to bed that night, having made up my mind that I was going to wake up the next morning and send an email and basically say I was shutting down the company. And so this will kind of like happen. And I think the thing that ended up helping me in those cases, which will help you kind of be more resilient, is you need to know why you are kind of like starting a startup and why you're kind of like working on this. I think a lot of times people kind of start startups because they're excited, and they don't really think that hard about it. Like Pranav, did you know why you wanted to start a startup before you started yours? Okay. Wow.
Not
Pranav,
precisely, not clearly, no.
you should have came to this event before you started your startup. And
Yeah.
by the way, I also didn't know either, right? And um, Pranav, did you end up figuring out what it was?
No.
Okay, interesting.
No. Yeah.
Um, so I kind of figured it out kind of like part of the way through, but I think knowing this going in is really kind of like helpful because again, you want to do as much of this kind of you want to do as much preparation work as you can before you kind of quit your job because once you quit your job, you're on the clock. You're like, okay, cool, I got 6 months to kind of figure this out. And if you got to spend a bunch of time kind of like I don't know, soul searching for kind of why you're doing this in the first place, then you're going to kind of lose time. And so you want to do this as much as possible, kind of like beforehand. Um, a couple of reasons maybe I can kind of share with people of what people's why reasons are, and I'll share good ones and I'll share bad ones. Obvious bad one is sometimes people start startups because they want to make a lot of money. And that's a really bad reason to start a startup because like the vast majority of time, like 99.9% of the time, you are not going to make any money. In fact, you're probably like going to go into debt. So if your why to kind of like doing a startup is to like make money, you're probably just not going to last for very long. So if that's your primary thing, like you probably want to think about other reasons for like why you'd want to do this. Cause honestly, you're going to like, there's better ways to make money than kind of like starting a startup. Um, my reason for kind of like starting a startup, which again, I only kind of learned about after the fact was um, I really like learning, and startups are like a perpetual motion machine of kind of like teaching me things because again, I just have to figure out so much stuff to like not die. And so that to me kind of like really helped me kind of all along the way because if I was, as long as I was learning, I would kind of like keep going on the startup. Learning is independent of like how the startup is actually doing. Like you actually learn a lot when your startup is going pretty badly. And so even it was funny. And at times when things were badly, I was almost kind of like more committed to the startup when then things were going well because I was like learning a lot. And when things were going well, I was like wasn't learning as much. And so that was kind of like uh one of kind of like the reasons that kind of like worked for me. But you want to have a good understanding of kind of what this is before you kind of like take the plunge. Pranav, I feel like with the more that I've kind of like talked about this, the other thing I kind of think about too is once you take the plunge, you're like treading water, and so you just want to be as prepared as possible before you like before you start
Yeah.
treading water, right?
Yeah. And I think two questions I want to ask you off the back of
Yeah.
that is one is what is the experience like? Because I don't think
Oh
anybody knows,
God.
but it's hard to know. But what was like the first 6 months of being a founder like?
God. Okay. I think what's going to be really interesting about this is I'm going to describe what the first 6 months is going to be like, and everybody on this call is going to be like, "Oh yeah, sure, sure, sure," and then like whoever actually does the like job, they're going to be like, they're almost going to like not believe me, and then they're going to do the job, and 6 months later, they're going to be like, "Oh yeah, it's exactly that." And that was the experience that I had. Like everybody told me how hard a startup was, and I like intellectually knew, but I don't think I was like prepared like emotionally and viscerally for how hard it actually kind of like was. And so it's like again, I don't maybe like a lot of people here are like this. I like read a bunch of blog posts and like watched a lot of like videos and podcasts about what the experience was like. So I like kind of definitely knew what it was like, but it was only until I actually did it where I was like, oh, I see what everybody's like talking about. Okay, what is it actually like? Maybe we'll just kind of talk the first kind of like 6 months here. The first month is kind of awesome. And what I mean by kind of awesome is it is like it's you're just it's you just live in a land of all of possibilities. There's a part of you in the first month where you're like, oh, yeah, there's a chance I'm going to be the next Zuckerberg here, right? And you're just kind of like, this is going to be amazing. This is the start of like a journey that is going to be kind of like, I'm going to tell stories about it on like, I don't know, on TV and stuff. And so you're just very kind of like optimistic and it's very exciting. And everything is possible. You haven't really kind of like tried to talk to kind of users and all of this kind of stuff. And so everything is great. And so the first month is just exciting. Like you're doing this new thing, you've taken the plunge and you're kind of like very excited. And so um almost the entire period, depending on how long it takes for you to start talking to users, is kind of great. Then you reach the next stage where you start talking to users and you try to start getting them to do stuff and you slam like headfirst into a wall. And you're basically like, oh shit, did I make a mistake here? Does nobody want what I like was like talking about? And hopefully like you want to slam into this wall before you quit your job. That's why the validation is really important. But like the experience for most people, me included, and kind of you, is they hit this wall after they hit that. Um, and this is like uh, this is like you've never kind of felt rejection kind of like this before. And I think the thing that would really start for me is I had never tried so hard at something and kind of poured myself into something for it to just like people just don't care. And so I think you kind of go from this like super high to this like really kind of like low. And you can elongate your period if you want. You can spend those kind of like you can elongate the honeymoon period basically by just like spending all your time like writing code and not talking to your users, which is by the way counterproductive. But the moment you actually start talking to users and trying to get people to do stuff, like that's where you like really meet the first acid test. And then you'll really struggle. Just you'll really kind of struggle through that. Um, what you do after that, I think, is actually the best. It will kind of like it's the best indicator of kind of like whether being a founder is going to be the right thing long term for you or not. I feel like it's a very kind of polarizing thing where everybody's excited in the first part, then everybody kind of tries to get users to do stuff. Basically, everybody fails at that stage, and then the next part after that is um, there are some people who can kind of get over the hump and they're like, okay, cool, this is not working. What do I got to do? Okay, make changes. Like they start working on the problem. And then there are some people who are kind of like, either they just like don't know what to do next, or they just kind of throw their hands up and they're like, ugh, like, and so then they kind of just don't stay founders for very long. And I think that period is actually probably the most interesting kind of like part. But to me, that's probably like the first kind of like those are like the three stages of maybe like the first 6 months is that euphoric kind of honeymoon period. Then there's like actually kind of meeting the real world and then kind of like really hitting that wall. And then, you know, it branches into these two parts of like, what do you do once you've like got punched in the face kind of stuff, right? What do you think, Pranav? Is that kind of like, does that square with kind of your experience?
Yeah, I mean, your honeymoon period lasts as long as you're building product, just
Yeah.
because there's no feedback loop. You haven't spoken to actual users then, and so it's all under your control, and that's exactly when it all goes outside your control, and then it sort of just depends on how you deal with that lack of control. We're going to move on to Q&A so
Yep.
in the interest of time. So the first question is, what is a pivotal moment in deciding to drop a job and start your own startup?
God, I feel like there's two ways, and if this is your question in the chat, and you don't mind, kind of like, I'm curious, kind of like which it is. Um, there is the way that a lot of people get into entrepreneurship, which is, and they can describe what that pivotal moment is, and then there's the pivotal moment. There's the moment that everyone should be doing. And so I can tell you what my pivotal moment was basically, is not the way that I suggest anybody kind of like doing it. But I think like the pivotal moment for me was I basically found people who wanted to kind of like quit their jobs with me. And it was really funny. The moment I found people who also wanted to quit their jobs to start a startup, that's when I quit my job to start a startup. Is that the way that you should do it? Not at all, right? But that's kind of what happened for me. And so we quit our job I quit my job without kind of like actually having an idea or anything like that. All I had was like basically a group of people to kind of like work with. But I also kind of hated my job and really wanted to start a startup, which I think is an experience for kind of like most people. But that isn't kind of like what you should be doing. The thing that you should be doing and the way how you decide to kind of actually kind of drop your job is you should have a problem that you want to solve and then have validation kind of like around that. You want to, maybe the way to kind of think about this, quitting your job is taking quite a bit of risk. And so you want to de-risk it as much as possible, and you want to de-risk that by, having a reasonable idea that, hey, your startup is probably kind of like at least promising. So you want to gather evidence that it's promising, and then hopefully that will de-risk kind of like quitting your job, or at least give you more evidence that maybe quitting your job is kind of like a reasonable idea. Not doing what I did, which is I didn't de-risk it at all. I was just kind of like looking for an excuse to start a company and quit my job. So.
What's your thought on being a solo
Uh,
founder versus having a co-founder?
I thought about whether this should be on the list. Okay, maybe the way that I kind of like think about this is there are certainly examples of people being successful with as solo founders. Actually, kind of the most successful people, a lot of successful ones, like Jeff Bezos is a solo founder. I guess Zuck, not technically, but kind of feels like it. But it's definitely easier with co-founders. And so my advice to everybody is like find co-founders. But you're better off as a solo founder than with co-founders that you don't like or you don't get along with. So I don't know, kind of like goes both ways. Practically what I would do though is I would just start work. If you have a problem that you want to solve and you have an idea for how to solve that, I would just start working on the idea and start working on the idea, gathering evidence. And once you start gathering evidence, your ability to attract co-founders kind of increases kind of like quite a lot. And so that's probably how I would tackle this is like, I wouldn't, I wouldn't kind of like not work on an idea just because I was a solo founder. But it's definitely kind of like easier.
Cool. The next question is, do you proceed a startup when you have full funding and you have a good problem to solve?
Definitely a good problem. So here's the thing that's I say this I get this a lot, a fair bit with people applying to Iterative. So basically, they want funding before they quit their job, which of course you do. That like de-risk a lot, right? Unfortunately, investors won't give you money before you quit your job. And this is like a hard rule at Iterative. And the reason why is because um, it's I as an investor, I want to see that somebody thinks it's a good idea such that they will quit their job before I give them money. And so the thing I always tell founders is founders leap first. And so, if you really believe in your idea, are you willing to quit your job for it? And if you're not, why am I giving you money first to kind of like do it? Right. It kind of tells me that maybe you like don't believe in the idea as much. And so to me, I'm like, you do have to kind of take a leap before you're going to get funding. Especially these days, when I first started, maybe this was more of the case because it costs more money to start a company, but now it costs like very little to start companies. And so this is increasingly becoming not the case.
Cool. The next question is, how can we make entrepreneurship more inclusive, considering the
Yeah.
suggestion 6-month personal runway that may exclude certain groups of founders?
This is really hard. The not everybody has 6 months of runway, and that's not fair. I think that's kind of like a hard truth of it. It's not fair. And that's kind of like the way it is at the moment. Okay, what can we possibly do? A lot of it then goes to, I mean, you should validate a bunch while you still have your job. And so I think for something that Iterative wants to do is like, hey, how do we teach people how to validate before quitting their job so that if they only have 6 months of runway or they have 3 months of runway, they are like much closer to like raising funding or kind of like going further that way. And so can we do a bunch of work before they actually quit their job? And I actually think you can do a fair bit of work there. So I think one part of this is like, hey, how do we help people kind of get further along in the process before they have to kind of quit their job? And I think there's like a fair bit that you can do. So that's probably the thing I would try to kind of figure out here.
Makes sense to work on a side project until PMF and then go full time and start the startup.
Yeah, this totally makes sense. This totally makes sense to me. I'll avoid the kind of PMF kind of like thing because I think it's hard to kind of define what that is. But here's what I would do, guys, for the most part. I would, if I have a problem that I want to solve and I have an idea, I would go work on that idea in my kind of spare time as much as possible, which is kind of like how we started. I would work on that as much as possible. Um, and I would try to get it to grow as much as I can. And the more it grows, the more evidence that suggests that this is like a promising idea. And so I would keep growing it and keep growing it. And at some point, if you can keep growing it, it almost becomes kind of like obvious that you're like, hey, this is such a good opportunity. I need to kind of like quit my job and like work on this thing. And so to me, I would kind of like do this as long as you kind of can until you're kind of like convinced that like, hey, this is really something I should quit my job and I should kind of work on it.
The technical degree or a business management degree more beneficial for an aspiring startup founder? Is attending university essential for this career path?
Um, oof. Okay, if I had to choose between a technical degree or a business management degree for kind of like aspiring startup founders, I'm going to choose the technical degree. Kind of like 9 times out of 10, actually 10 out of 10. Just because at the end of the day, you're going to need to build something, and being able to build something is kind of like useful. Now, the thing that I'll kind of point out though is like neither of them is any kind of guarantee of success. So there's a lot of people with technical degrees that like aren't kind of successful, and then there's lots of examples of people with business kind of degrees who are like gonna like not be successful. And so I don't think this is a kind of like either one. So if you're making me choose, I would choose technical degree, but none of them are kind of like none of them are gonna any kind of guarantee of success.
Is it necessary to attend university to become a founder, I guess?
Oh no. No, no, not at all. There is nothing that I think is essential to becoming a founder. I don't think you necessarily have to go to college. You certainly don't have to have any kind of like specific kind of degree or anything like that, right? Um, a couple reasons for this. One is there is nothing that universities teach you that make you prepared for being a founder. Actually, I don't think there's anything that really prepares you for being a founder until you actually become a founder. It's just one of those things. So no kind of like thing there. Most of the time, what you're doing as a founder is you are like doing stuff you don't know how to do, and you are definitely not qualified to do. And so none of it kind of like really kind of like matters. So no, don't think it's necessary to go to university in order to kind of like be a founder. Don't think, any of these degrees are kind of kind of essential. These things help, but by no means are they kind of essential.
Cool. So next one is, what if your startup is something that's already existing and
Yeah.
does well and validate? Do you always have to have something disruptive or innovative or new?
No. Look, I mean, I think the thing that we care about, and I think all kind of founders care about, is are you solving an important problem for people? Sometimes solving an important problem is like not disruptive and like not that innovative. It was just like something that like nobody else kind of like bothered to solve, and you're solving it. That's it. Right. So no, doesn't have to be disruptive, doesn't have to be innovative. We can debate what kind of new means, but like as long as you are solving a problem, an important problem for people, and you can show that by the fact that you're like growing quickly and like lots of people are using your product, nothing else kind of matters.
Is freedom a good reason for starting a startup? The why? Why?
Oh God, this is such a good thing. If you are starting a venture-backed company, there's two versions of basically startups. There's like bootstrap startups and there's venture-backed startups. And they're very different in terms of freedom. I actually think if you're starting a venture-backed startup, you have less freedom. And you have less freedom because you have kind of like more like responsibility, and the buck stops with you. Like you're just always like nothing happens unless you're kind of like doing something. And so I had less freedom running venture back kind of like startups than people who like worked normal jobs. I always looked at people who worked normal jobs. I'm like, oh my God, you're like workday ends and you just like go home and don't think about it. Like to me, I'm kind of like, oh my God, is my startup gonna die? And like I don't like I'm thinking about it all the time. And so I think for venture back startups, you actually have less freedom. Bootstrapped companies, I actually think you can have a reasonable kind of like freedom there, right? So if you're doing more of a lifestyle business, maybe in the beginning it's a little bit hard, but you're not under the gun as much, right? You're kind of like, and so I think you may have a good bit of freedom there. So I think it depends on kind of which way you're kind of like going here. If what you're talking about with freedom is financial freedom, then that's kind of a different calculation, because it's kind of like, well, you know, is if I have a lot of money, will that kind of give me some like freedom? And it's like, yeah, the answer is like, yes, it kind of like will. And so then the question is like, okay, is starting a startup a good way to make a lot of money so that you have financial freedom? Possibly, but you're kind of like the odds are definitely kind of like against you. I feel like starting a startup for money has very low probability of success, but like the ceiling is basically unlimited, and so that's the game kind of people play on that one. But I think if you are starting a venture-backed company because you think you'll have freedom, I think that's probably not the case. You will basically get to make decisions though. So you get a lot of responsibilities, and so you have the freedom to make decisions. But I think as any founder will tell you, um, it's definitely feels more like responsibility than freedom, I think, in that case.
Next question is it necessary to join accelerators to get started or boost growth? What are the pros and cons?
As somebody who runs an accelerator, the answer is absolutely not. It's not. It's not necessary, guys. Right? Most startups in the world never join an accelerator. And we, I guess our second company, we were part of YC, but like, it's not necessary. You can definitely do this without joining an accelerator. You know, Facebook never joined an accelerator. Amazon never joined an accelerator, blah, blah, blah. So certainly not necessary. Okay. What are the pros and cons? The pros are, if you're joining, by the way, don't join an accelerator that doesn't give you any money. But if you're joining an accelerator like Iterative, we invest in your company, so you get some money. And then you get to basically kind of work with some people who have kind of like done what you're trying to do before, and so that can oftentimes be helpful. The cons are, what are the cons? The cons are sometimes there are bad accelerators who like give you kind of like bad advice and don't give you money and charge you money and all that kind of stuff. And so some of those accelerators I don't think I'm like that grateful for. What are the other cons? I think sometimes people think accelerators are going to solve all their problems. They're like, "Oh, I'm starting a startup. I got into this accelerator. That means I'm going to be successful." And it's like that's not the case at all. As much as I think Iterative kind of like does a good job, we are no guarantee. And by the way, YC is also this way. There are no guarantee of kind of like your success. The majority of companies that go through YC fail, and the majority of companies that go through Iterative fail too. Right. Hopefully we can kind of increase your chances of success and kind of build some community around you and all of that kind of stuff. And so hopefully that's kind of like helpful, but no guarantee of success. Like that's not the case at all. As much as I think Iterative kind of like does a good job, we are no guarantee. And by the way, YC is also this way. There are no guarantee of kind of like your success. The majority of companies that go through YC fail, and the majority of companies. And so, but they are not kind of like necessary. And I don't even think of them as kind of markers of success. I feel like there are some founders who are like, my primary optimization right now for my startup is to get into an accelerator, and like that's always the wrong optimization. Your primary optimization is always should be, am I solving an important problem for kind of like people, and am I solving in kind of like the best way for kind of like my users and growing quickly? Like that's the only thing that kind of matters. An accelerator is just a means to an end to kind of like be able to do that.
All right. So the next question is it smart to have your own startup despite not being a developer or having a tech background? Say you're more on the strategic or marketing side.
100%. If you want to start a startup for kind of the myriad reasons to start a startup, you should start a startup. Don't worry about your background. Don't worry about what school you went to. Don't worry about what major. Like, don't worry about it. Like, if you want to start a startup, you should start a startup. And so don't worry about any of this kind of stuff. As an example of this, because he just messaged me, if people are familiar with Xendit, it is Stripe for Indonesia. And Moses is a friend of ours. He actually flew into orientation to speak to our most recent batch, and he is not technical. So if you guys look him up, his name is Moses Slow. He started Xendit. It's worth a couple $2 billion in Indonesia. He's not technical, right? I would say it was pretty smart for him to kind of like start a startup, right? And having not those things. Now, what he ended up being really good at though was a startup. To be honest, the engineering part is the easy part of the startup. The other parts are like way harder. So figuring out like what your idea should be, how to reach people, what do people really kind of want? How do you kind of grow your startup? All of these things are kind of like much harder problems with the startup. And so, I think those are kind of like good places for people who are non-technical to kind of work on. He told me the story once of how he recruited his team. So he went to a hackathon in California, and he basically went to this hackathon. He's not technical, and if anybody's been to a hackathon, you basically know that all the non-technical people are like not highly sought after in hackathons because the hackathon is about building stuff. He went to the best engineers and he basically said, "Hey, you guys should join my team because we're going to win this hackathon, and you don't have to do anything. I'm going to prove to you how valuable I am." And basically, what he did was, he went and recruited all the best people. So he demonstrated that he's like very convincing, and then he basically made like the best pitch at the hackathon, and then won the hackathon. And he was like, and he's basically convinced, showing people how convincing he is. And I think he got like paying users like at the hackathon. So he was everybody else was writing code, and he like went out and sold stuff. And so again, he's just demonstrating to people like his skills, which are non-technical and very important. So yeah, no problem.
How do you validate your idea in this day and age?
Okay, we have lots of events and content on this, and so June, if you are there, you should drop some links. But I will tackle this. I'll just answer this quickly, kind of like here. Okay, so validating, there are two types of companies you can start. You can start a consumer company. You can start a company that targets businesses. The validation paths for those are very different. If you are starting a company that who their customers are going to be other businesses, the typical way that you validate this is you start reaching out to people on LinkedIn. And so like, I don't know, let's say take Pranav's original kind of startup idea of
people who want to work from co-working spaces on a pay-per-use basis.
Okay, like different co-working spaces, basically, right? Okay, so let's say that Pranav was like, hey, I bet the people, I want to be able to sell this to companies so that they can offer it to their employees. I don't know if that's what you actually did, but let's say that's what you wanted to do. Okay, then what I would do if I was Pranav is I would go and be like, what types of companies typically would want to offer this to their employees? And it's like, startups probably want to do this, and probably remote startups want to do this, right? So, that seems like a reasonable kind of place. Okay. Then what I would do is I would go out and I would try to find a list of like 50 remote startups. And maybe I just find startups in general, but actually I would try to find 50 remote startups. How do you find 50 remote startups? I would just look at job postings, because if the job postings typically have whether they are remote or not, and you can typically kind of find this that way. So I would probably find job postings, and then I'd find 50 startups, and then I would basically just find whoever the founder of all these startups are, and then I would message them on LinkedIn being like, hey, I noticed that you are growing your team and that you are remote. Have one of the things that I have heard from a lot of our other customers, even though you don't have customers, is that providing kind of a space for people to work, even for remote teams, is like really helpful. I have this like, I think I can help you here. Here's what my product kind of does. Can we talk about it? Do you want to talk about it? And I would basically just figure out, I reached out to 100 people. What percentage of those people responded to my message? What percentage of them then also got on a call with me? And then I would actually try to sell it to them, be like, okay, cool. Like, here's kind of how much it costs. It's going to be ready in a month. Like, pay me, right? So that's how I would validate a business one. You can kind of adapt that to kind of like other business ideas, but they kind of mechanically work the same. Let's take the consumer version of Pranav's product, which is, let's say he wants to just like sell this to like individuals and not companies and that kind of stuff. Well, in that case, then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a landing page that explains kind of what the product does. And I'm going to make some hypothesis on what types of people typically want this. So I'm like, maybe what it is it's maybe kind of like new college grads who kind of like want to like do this, maybe who work in like tech companies or something like this, and maybe I can run Instagram ads against kind of like certain kind of age groups or whatever, and then drive them to this landing page, see how many of them actually kind of sign up, and you can kind of do it that way. And so I would validate kind of that way. So one is kind of like a paid marketing kind of way, which by the way, you can spend like $10 a day and do this. And the other one is just do LinkedIn outreach. Validation's only gotten easier, guys, as time goes on. It used to be harder.
What would be your approach to identifying important problems to solve?
Ooh, okay. I once wrote a really long blog post about this. Maybe my grand unified theory of important problems are problems that a lot of people have, and for each individual person is very painful. So you can think about this like 2 by 2. So obviously kind of the most important problems are problems that lots of people have, very painful. For whoever's answer, read the blog post. It's better than what I was going to say.
All right. Being a founder of a young age a huge disadvantage in being a startup founder, in the sense investors looking down on you for the lack of experience?
No. I get where this comes from though, because when I started the first company, I was 22. I'm 41 now. So kind of done it at kind of like the different kind of ages. Okay. Pros and cons of being young and starting a startup. Actually, that should be a blog post. Pros. You are basically fearless because you are really naive, I'm guessing. And by the way, I don't say this in a negative way. I was super naive, but that made me like invincible. I think the entire reason I started a startup was because I had no idea how hard it was. I had no idea what to expect. I was like, oh, this sounds fun. And so I just like did it. If I had never started a startup and I was going to start a startup now at 41, I think I wouldn't do it. I feel like I just know too much now. And so I joke sometimes like there's no confidence, kind of like young confidence, because you just don't know, right? And it's like fantastic. And again, I'm not saying this in like a negative way. It's fantastic. Like you should take advantage of that, right? Like that's why young people do like crazy stuff, and most of the time they fail, but every once in a while they're kind of right, and because they're the only part of the population who is like crazy enough to try this thing, and they like don't realize that like tons of people have tried this thing and none of them kind of worked out, but it's kind of great. So I think there's real advantages to being young. Oh, also consumer companies, like all of the, especially the social stuff, all of that comes from young people. Like I have no business starting a social product now. I'm like 41 and I barely like want to see my friends, and so it's just like I just have no business kind of doing that. For the investor looking down, I think you'll find this more from bad investors. I think if you are talking to kind of good investors, this is never kind of like a negative thing. Good investors are never going to look down on you for like the lack of like work experience. Like I just think that's kind of like a dumb thing to look down on. But what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to do the work for your startup. And so I guess what I mean by this is like the way that you overcome this is you validate your idea. Right. And so, yeah, maybe you don't have kind of like 10 years of experience or whatever, but like you validated your idea and this thing is kind of growing and all of that kind of stuff. But I don't actually think this is much of an advantage. And by the way, I do think this is more this experience of kind of like being looked down upon is probably more common in Southeast Asia. And in SF, it's almost the reverse. Like you're kind of looked down upon if you're too old, which is kind of like bad in the other direction. But no, I don't think this is a huge disadvantage.
Next question is, do you need to have an advisor in the industry you're playing in during your building stages? And how do you optimize having advisors and do you pay them?
You don't need to have anything, right? So when you're starting a startup, you don't need to be part of an accelerator. You don't need to have advisors. You don't need to have a co-founder. Some of these things are useful, but you don't need to have any of them. I also think industry advisors are completely overrated, guys. Totally overrated. I don't actually think they're kind of like end up being that useful, especially not at the very, very early stages. I could see them being more useful in the later stages, but I think the early stage is not that useful. I also think kind of like paid advisors is totally overrated. I don't tell any of our companies to kind of like get advisors for any kind of like paid stuff. And for a lot of the companies that I was helping or advising, I never took any kind of equity and all of that kind of stuff. I think good people kind of want to help you if they're kind of interested, and they're not going to kind of like want to help you kind of like otherwise. There's no amount of like equity you can kind of offer me to help you if I'm like not interested. So I don't think you need any of this. It can be helpful, especially if you're in a industry that is like very siloed, or sorry, not siloed. Like my father worked in semiconductor manufacturing. If I was going to start a semiconductor manufacturing company, I probably want to like have some people I can talk to about semiconductor manufacturing, but it's like not necessary to have them as an advisor. I just need like people I can talk to. So I guess I'm maybe kind of drawing the line of like helpful to have people to talk to, but like not necessary to like have an advisor, and definitely not necessary to have like a paid advisor. In case anybody is thinking about this, all I advise people not to have kind of like paid advisors, but for the ones that are going to have paid advisors and you're going to give them equity, the thing that I always suggest is like 0.1% or something like that. I feel like I hear some people like they want to be an advisor and they want 10% of your company. That is absolute bullshit. Run to the like run, 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 run. Never like that's never worth it. If I was investing in a company and I saw somebody with 10% equity ownership and I was like, who is this person? And the founder was like, it's an advisor. I'd be like, ooh, can't invest in this company anymore. That's too much ownership for somebody who does not work on the like company full time. So anyway.
What do you do with funding? Why raise at all?
Why raise at all? The reason why you raise funding is to go faster. Right. And so you want to be able to grow faster. And so look, money is just a resource. There's nothing magical about it. It's just a resource. And sometimes it's advantageous to have more resources so that you can grow faster. So here's a good example. Let's say that you were starting a ride hailing company in Southeast Asia. And let's say you didn't raise any funding. You definitely wouldn't survive and you weren't going to win. Right? Because ride hailing is one of these kind of like businesses where funding really kind of helps. And there's like a moment in time which you need to be in which you need to establish yourself as the winner. And funding will help you kind of like do that and to kind of grow fast. And so it's kind of like a land grab and money helps you kind of like land grab faster. So that's the reason why you need money basically is so that you can kind of grow faster in case kind of like the market that you're in is kind of like time sensitive, right? Like Pranav, your startup, from my understanding of it, there's actually lots of startups that kind of were working on that startup. And so if that ended up being, and none of them I feel like are doing that well, if I'm being honest, but if that ended up being kind of like a really lucrative space, Pranav was competing against a bunch of people and like it's not going to be quite winner take all, but it's going to be like one or two. And so Pranav needs to make sure he's the one or two. And if he doesn't raise funding, he probably is not going to be the one or two, basically.
How did you go from 0 to 1 and then 1 to 10? What is your preferred way to begin at the start?
I mean, it kind of depends on what you mean, kind of like by 0 to 1 and kind of like 1 to 10. I mean, what is my preferred way to start? I mean, my preferred way. Okay, here's my preferred way to start. I come up with a list of a bunch of problems that kind of exist in the world. And honestly, there's so many problems in the world. Like, it's like, honestly, I've never kind of had a hard time with that. There's just like tons of problems in the world. And so my preferred way to do it is I always have like a list of like 20 things that I think are problems in the world. I stack rank those like 20 things into like order of like how important I think the problem is. And then I pick 3 problems at a time and I validate those 3 problems at any given time. I work on I think like 1 week or 2 week sprints. And so basically the idea here is at any given time, I'm trying to validate 3 problems at a time. You should try to probably validate 1. That's where I started out. You just get better at this. And so you can do faster. So 3 at a time. And then I'm trying to get people to actually like pay me and use these products. Every 2 weeks or so, I basically will look at the results and being like, okay, well, which one of these was the hardest to kind of like sell and had the least validation? I cut that problem and I pick another one from the set. And so I'm kind of like rotating to try to figure out which is the like most important problem and which one I've kind of hit on the most. And then if I do that kind of like for enough kind of like problems and one problem seems to kind of like stand out, be the one that just has the path of least resistance, like this is the easiest to solve. It costs the least amount of money to acquire a customer, all that kind of stuff. Then I increasingly kind of like work more on that. And then I move that problem into the 1 to 10 stage and I try to build it out more. What's maybe non-obvious to kind of people who are working on this is you often will go from 0 to 1 to 1 to 10, back to 0 to 1, and then back to 1 to 10, and then 0 to 1. So it's actually not a linear process, but I kind of have this pruning strategy. That's how I do it.
How do you motivate and resilience to the challenges of starting a startup?
That's a really good question and an important one. So I'm going to caveat this by saying this is different. This is going to be different for everybody because everybody is different, right? So what motivates me is different from what motivates Pranav and what motivates June and whoever it is that answers this question. So the real answer to this is you want to have a good understanding of kind of like what motivates you and what kind of like helps you, and then you want to double down on those things. Interesting kind of like thing about being a founder is I probably have a better understanding of what motivates me and what helps me be resilient because I was a founder, and it taught me a lot about kind of just like how to find this in myself. A few of the things that kind of helped me though, I talked about this kind of before. I have a very clear kind of like why I kind of do these things. And so I think that helps quite a lot. I'm quite value driven, and so I need to kind of really kind of like have a good understanding of why I'm kind of like doing something, and that thing needs to kind of like matter to me. So learning has been the primary one for kind of most of my kind of I guess career. But iterative actually is the one kind of thing that I've worked on where I kind of like care about the problem the most. And so iterative is less I'm less motivated iterative based on learning. I'm more motivated because I think we need to kind of like uh help people be more successful in kind of entrepreneurship. And so I just care about this kind of like more here. So I think that helps me quite a lot. And then there's a bunch of tactical stuff around kind of just like a support system and kind of people to talk to. And I think a big benefit of kind of being part of it is you're with a group of people who are kind of going through the challenges of starting a startup. And that tends to help quite a lot too. But there's even everyday stuff like exercise seems to help quite a lot, sleeping help, like all of these things kind of like help. And so you can kind of tackle these at all these different stages. But I think having a good understanding of kind of like why you're doing what you're doing, and when you're kind of really down, tying it back to that and kind of thinking about that will kind of help kind of like push you through.
All right. So next question is, what is some bad advice you hear given to new founders? What is some new bad advice you hear given?
Oh my God, this should be an entire post that I should. Okay, what is bad advice that I hear given to new founders? Try to fundraise. Go talk to investors. Like if you're a new founder, like that's not what you should be doing. You should be trying to like understand your problem, talking to users and all that kind of stuff. And so I don't know. I just feel like sometimes I hear founders kind of get this advice about kind of like talking to investors, or at least they think it is. And so I think that's kind of like tends to be kind of like bad advice. I'm just thinking about investors. I'm just thinking about all the bad advice investors give new founders, which is a lot. Like 5-year kind of like projection plans, nonsense. It's all bullshit. Like there's no way you have a 5-year projection. Useless exercise.
I got bad specific advice. I think so. When I was building the co-founder thing, somebody, sorry, co-working thing, some said the first thing you should do is build a community. I was like, but how does that link to the problem at all? So I think it's a lot of advice that doesn't link to.
I think a lot of bad advice you kind of given to new founders is advice that is not specific enough to actually like founders to kind of do anything with. And so there's a lot of stuff that is like, you're a new founder. Here's one. I feel like people always kind of talk about like, you need to make sure that your product is like best in class or something like that. That is bad advice. Like you should be making an MVP that is like kind of shitty and kind of like get it in front of people. It takes like, I mean, it takes years to make a best in class thing. So I think that's kind of like bad advice that kind of like people get. All the stuff that's like hire the best people, like be really ambitious is all too vague to really matter. And so I just think it's like, it sounds nice, but I think it's like practically bad advice.
What points to consider when you want to build an impactful startup where sometimes profit might not be an immediate return?
I mean, look, I think it depends on how you want to define impactful, right? So this is kind of different for everybody. But to me, I think about it as like, again, it's kind of just the important problem kind of framework. Again, your startup is almost by definition impactful if you're helping a lot of people, and if you're helping if you're helping a lot of people kind of a lot, right? And so to me, that's like impactful. And that has nothing to do with profit. So I would probably kind of think about it that way. What points to consider? Maybe the thing I would kind of like, so I would think about how many people you're kind of helping, and then how kind of like how much you're kind of helping each individual one. That's the only thing I would figure out. There's not kind of like much more than that. It's just like really kind of focus in on that piece of it. And that has nothing to do with profit. So I think that's the only thing you should kind of focus on. Yeah, as long as you're doing that, you're kind of building an impactful startup.
From 0 to 100%, how clear should it be before it becomes a startup? How clear, what percentage of clarity the idea should have is my guess. Please correct me if I'm wrong in the chat if this is your question.
I don't know what 100% means, and I don't know what 0% means, and so I have a hard time answering this question. But let me try to answer the spirit of it. I think what you want to have to become a startup is I think a startup is in manifestation of a hypothesis a founder has about the world, right? And the hypothesis has two parts. One hypothesis is, I think this is a problem that a lot of people have and they would like to be solved. Okay. And then the second part of the hypothesis, I think it can be solved if we do this. right? And so if you have both of those parts, you can become a startup. Now we can talk about kind of like or growth plans and how much detail do you want to know, but at a minimum I think you can become a startup if you can answer those two questions and you have a hypothesis about those two things. So maybe that's how I would think about it.
If I'm a non-tech person who wants
Yeah.
to start a startup, do I need a product manager as a co-founder in addition to a CTO?
No. No. I mean, look, okay, let's talk about the different types of founders that typically there are. So there typically is the technical founder. And by the way, you don't need anybody. Like you could just start, I mean, you could just start this company now, right? You don't need a CTO. You don't need a kind of like, you can figure this out. But just to kind of in the spirit of this question, there is typically a technical co-founder, like type, and then there's typically kind of like there are also product co-founders and then there are sales co-founders. That tends to be kind of like the three kind of like archetypes. You don't need all three to start a company. But those are kind of like the three. It tends to be that whoever is the non-technical co-founder is probably going to end up being the product person in the early days because they're probably going to do sales and they're probably going to do product at the same time. And those things kind of need to feed into each other. And so to me, I'm kind of like, okay, if you're the non-technical person, and you're not going to do product and you're not going to code, I'm like, what are you doing? Right? I mean, if there's only going to be like two or three of you, you got to like kind of do those things. And so, yeah, you don't need a product manager for sure. And you definitely don't need a product manager when you start a startup. Like you don't need any employees when you start a startup. Like you guys should just be doing it yourself.
What are some must-read books for an aspiring startup founder?
Oh God, this is the question for me, guys. All right, are you ready? You should read Founders at Work by Jessica Livingston. Jessica Livingston is one of the co-founders of YC, and it is the best encapsulation of what it's actually like to start a company. And if you read those stories, by the way, they are painful and kind of horrible. Like they are like traumatizing, like how bad some of the kind of like situations people were in. And I think there are like two responses to this book. I read this book and it's basically about how hard it is to be a founder and how terrible it is. And I read the book and I was like, I cannot wait. I have to be one of these things. And again, it feels like a book that's talking you out of entrepreneurship because of how bad it is. And like the entire time I'm reading it, I'm like, oh my God, I got to do this thing. This sounds fantastic. And you might have the similar response, which means you probably should be a founder. You might also have the response, which is like, this all sounds horrible. Why does anybody do this? And maybe entrepreneurship is not for you. So that's one book. Second book is called PayPal Wars. And I just think it's kind of like a interesting kind of just like how crazy kind of startups are, and they're kind of like quite fun. And so I think there's that. I will now kind of talk about two blogs that I kind of read kind of religiously when I kind of like started out. So the first one is you should just read a bunch of all the Paul Graham essays. Like they are basically like the gospel in San Francisco, and I think for good reason. And so I think the Paul Graham essays are kind of really good. He's written a ton of them now, and I think it's like it basically covers kind of every topic you could be interested in. The other one is I would read Mark Andreessen's blog. I don't know if it's still online. I think it's like P. Marsa is what I would Google. And he has an entire kind of like 7-part blog series on how to start a startup. And I think it's just absolute kind of like gold. And so those are the ones that I would kind of like read. So I would read those books. I would read those blogs.
I think I have a different answer where I would say stray away from big company books.
Oh,
like stuff like Google, Shoe Dog kind of stuff, like the corporation kind of books. I just don't think they're useful in telling you the startup journey. Yeah, so different, but otherwise, Paul Graham essays for sure.
Here's my general rule for what you want to read as an aspiring startup founder. Read books by people who have been founders. That you're typically kind of like in better place because if you read kind of like a bunch of stuff about entrepreneurship from people who are kind of like have not gone through that journey, it tends to kind of like not be as kind of like useful or kind of like valuable. Yeah. Big company books, like what big company books? Like Shoe Dog? It's a good book.
Even Shoe Dog, even the Google book. I mean, they're good books, but like, you shouldn't be reading that on becoming a startup founder. You know, because it can skew your priorities and problems. And
oh, really?
Yeah, I felt that.
I think it's I mean, I've read Shoe Dog. It's a good book, but I don't know if it's like very kind of like practically helpful. It's a good story, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know if it's like practically kind of like helpful. I think is maybe kind of like the trick.
Yeah.
Oh, read Lenny's blog. He has a blog. He has a newsletter. Lenny's blog is like the opposite, where it's like super tactical and like super helpful. So I wish Lenny Rachiski, I don't know how to say his last name. I wish his blog existed when I was starting out, because I feel like I would have learned like so much. And I had to learn it the hard way, which sucks. Thanks everyone. Start startups.